All right. This hearing will come to order. I start by asking unanimous consent that the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Waltz, be allowed to sit on the dais and participate in today's hearing without objection. So ordered. Welcome. Nice to have you with us. This hearing, entitled "The Status of American Hostages in Iran," will allow members of the Levinson, Namazi, and Zakov families to share information about their loved ones who remain imprisoned or missing in Iran. The hearing will also help subcommittee members examine how Congress can both hold Iran accountable for its actions and advance efforts to bring detained American citizens and legal residents home. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations in the rules. I will offer an opening statement, then turn it over to the ranking member, Mr. Wilson, for his opening statement. I want to welcome our witnesses. I am heartbroken to see you back at this table. I thank each of you for your courage and for your advocacy. It is my goal to have this be the last hearing like this that we do together. I want to acknowledge all the family members that are here today in the audience, and if you would, I would ask you to stand. Please know that we see you and we support you and we thank you. Thank you for being here. You may be seated, thanks. I thank the ranking member for his partnership. In conjunction with today's hearing, Ranking Member Wilson and I are introducing a number of related legislative efforts. We would welcome the support of all members of the subcommittee. Saturday will mark the 12th anniversary of the disappearance of Robert Levinson from Iran's Kish Island. Bob was last seen at his hotel on March 9th, 2007. Bob is a patriot. Bob devoted 30 years to serving his country, first with the DEA and then a quarter century with the FBI. Bob is a husband of 40 years. He is a father of 7. He is a grandfather of 6, 5 of whom he has never met. Bob is my constituent and a part of our community back in Coral Springs, Florida. Bob is not at home enjoying his retirement and his family because of Iran. In the days after Bob disappeared, Iranian state TV reported he was in government custody, yet the story soon changed. To this day, Iran's leaders refuse to acknowledge it is responsible for Bob's disappearance. The regime has never fulfilled its repeated promises of assistance on locating and returning Bob. To echo my former Florida colleague, Senator Bill Nelson, who fought on behalf of the Levinson family for a decade, if Iran doesn't have Bob, they know who does and where to find him. Bob Levinson is the longest-held American hostage. Today, Mr. Wilson and I introduced the Bob Levinson Hostage-Taking Accountability Act that strengthens U.S. government policy on hostage-taking and authorizes sanctions on those who engage in hostage-taking. Today, we are joined by Bob's wife, Christine, and 3 of his 7 children, Sarah, Dan, and Doug. We thank them and their 4 siblings, Susan, Stephanie, Samantha, and David, for their strength and for their advocacy. I've gotten to know the Levinsons over the past 9 years I've been in Congress. They are remarkable. I'm grateful to know them, and I wish that I didn't have to know them under these circumstances. Doug and Dan have each sat at this witness table where their mother sits today. We must not convene another hearing where we sit across from a member of this family. Iran's despicable practice of holding Americans and other foreign nationals hostage shouldn't be tolerated by any responsible nation. Today we'll hear from Babak Namazi about the horrific conditions his brother and father have faced since they were imprisoned in 2015 and 16, respectively. Siamak, detained first, followed by his father, Bakr, a former United Nations official, is in his 80s. Bakr's health has dramatically deteriorated since his detention. Siamak and Bakr were sentenced to 10 years in prison at a sham trial. Their appeals repeatedly denied. Bakr should not spend the rest of his life in prison. He and Siamak must be released immediately and returned to their family. The subcommittee first heard from Omar Zaka when he was still in high school. Omar's father, Nizar, is a U.S. legal permanent resident and a Lebanese citizen. Nizar is an IT professional who was invited to Iran to participate in an IT conference. Let me say that again. He was invited to the country and then detained. Nizar has been in prison since 2015, and his physical state has weakened. Like the Namazis, he was sentenced to 10 years in a sham trial in 2016. And these families are not the only families suffering. There are other Americans in Iran. Jiyu Wang is a doctoral student at Princeton who went to Iran to do research for his dissertation. He was arrested on bogus charges and sentenced to 10 years in Iran's notorious Evin prison. I note that just months ago, Iran also arrested Michael White, a U.S. Navy veteran, in July. White was beaten, has no money to hire a lawyer, and still does not know if any charges are filed against him. White is a former cancer patient, and his health is worsening. Furthermore, there are Canadians and Brits and French detained in Iran. It is disgusting the way that this regime disregards the human rights of its own people and of foreign nationals. Hostage-taking is a violation of international law. For the Levinsons, they've now worked with 3 U.S. administrations. The rest of the families are now on their second. They encounter the same problems time after time, well-meaning officials who run into bureaucratic hurdles, geopolitical shifts in our relations with Iran, and worst of all, being left behind when others come home. This administration has taken pride in its ability to bring Americans home, but I am concerned that the withdrawal from the JCPOA, the heightened rhetoric and lack of contact with any Iranian officials may slow down efforts to return these Americans to their families. But I urge the administration, and I urge President Trump, to sit down with each of these families, hear their stories, understand their suffering, and then take bold action to return their loved ones. And I'll now turn it over to the ranking member, Mr. Wilson, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Ted Deutsch. I want to thank you for holding this important hearing today. I'm grateful to work with you on this subcommittee on such critical issues. You have long fought for the release of Americans unjustly held in Iran, and I've been particularly inspired by your hard work highlighting the case of your constituent, Robert Levinson, who disappeared in Iran in 2007. Sadly, today is the 12th anniversary of his disappearance. I hope that together we can continue the bipartisan tradition of the committee of elevating these tragic cases, as you and the former chairman of the subcommittee, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, have been so successful in raising this issue in the past. Ms. Levinson, Mr. Namazi, Mr. Zaka, thank you for being here today to share your stories of your loved ones. None of us can imagine what your families go through every single day. Your testimony today will give Congress and the American people a small window into the unimaginable reality that you face each day. Iran is currently holding at least 8 Americans and dual U.S. Iranian nationals on trumped-up charges that amount to clear and definitive hostage-taking. At least 9 other individuals with British, French, Australian, and Canadian nationality are also being held by the regime. This is unfortunately not the first time this subcommittee has held a hearing on Iran's hostages. Iran's taking of hostages in exchange for political or financial concessions is morally reprehensible. It is symbolic of Iran's outrageous disregard for international law and basic human decency. It goes hand in hand with the regime's designation as the foremost state sponsor of terrorism in the world. We need to see additional pressure and sanctions specifically against the Iranian individuals and entities responsible for detaining the family members of our witnesses here today. Iran has been taking hostages as a matter of policy, and we must force Iran to change its behavior. We need to see an intense, concerted effort from Congress and the administration to seek the release of our Americans who are being held in Iran. I'm grateful to join Chairman Deutsch as the lead Republican on 2 important pieces of legislation introduced today, including a resolution that will be calling for the immediate release of Mr. Levinson, Si Amak, and Bakr Namazi, and Nizar Zaka. What all 3 are U.S. and all other U.S. citizens. Legal permanent residents and foreign nationals which are being held in Iran. The other crucial measure that will be introduced would impose sanctions on any foreign person responsible for or complicit in the unlawful detention abroad of a U.S. national. It's time for Iran and other rogue regimes to pay the price for taking American hostages. I urge this committee to take up the bills as soon as possible, and hey, I know they will with Chairman Deutsch. Thank you again for the extraordinary and brave and courageous witnesses who are here today. We look forward to your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I'll now introduce the witnesses. Mrs. Christine Levinson is the wife of Robert Levinson. Mr. Babak Namazi is the brother of Siamak Namazi and the son of Bakr Namazi. And Mr. Omar Zaka is the son of Nizar Zaka. Mrs. Levinson, you're recognized. Please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. And without objection, your written statements will be made a part of the record. Thanks again for being here, Christine. Mrs. Levinson. You could turn your microphone on.
Push button. Okay, I'm sorry. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and distinguished members of this committee. My name is Christine Levinson. I am the wife of Robert Bob Levinson, an American held by the Iranian government. My husband is the longest held hostage in American history. If I had my choice, I would not be sitting here before you to give the testimony I am about to give. I would be sitting at home with my husband by my side. I am only here out of necessity. My husband, Bob, has been a hostage for 12 years. Despite trying to get him home by every means possible, I am absolutely no closer than I was when he first went missing on March 9th, 2007. I hold the Iranian government responsible, but I believe the U.S. government is at fault as well. Bob was taken nearly 12 years ago to this day on Kish Island, Iran. Since that time, my family and I have had no direct contact with him. A few years ago, we received a video of him as a hostage pleading for help of the United States government. Then we received photos of him wearing an orange jumpsuit. We have been unable to obtain any information on what needs to be done to return Bob home. All the facts of this case tell us that the Iranian authorities kidnapped my husband. I have been to Kish Island. I believe it would be impossible for the Iranian government not to know what happened to Bob. We have confirmed that he made it to his hotel on Kish on March 8th, 2007, and left the hotel the next day. But his name was nowhere to be found on the passenger manifest for the flight returning to Dubai. Additionally, the FBI assessment of the video and photos we received years later concluded that the Iranian government had to have developed them and sent them to us. The FBI also has a $5 million reward that remains unclaimed. The evidence is so conclusive that the United Nations released an opinion in 2016 holding Iran responsible for Bob's continued deprivation of liberty. Yet Iran has been allowed to feign ignorance over and over again, with absolutely no consequences from the U.S. My family's dreams of reuniting with Bob continue to remain just dreams. We believe he is alive, and we continue to receive reports that he is alive. At this time, there is mounting urgency for his health and well-being. Every moment is of the essence for Bob, who turned 71 this Saturday. After 3 very different presidential administrations, we are no closer to bringing Bob home than we were when we started. We have nothing. There have been some dedicated people from various government agencies on the front lines of Bob's case working hard to get him home. We are deeply grateful to them. At the same time, we have experienced shocking dysfunction from our other officials. It became clear to me early on that major government bodies were not even talking to each other about the case. In the past, statements and misstatements to the media by U.S. officials about Bob's status, questioning if he is alive or in Iran, have severely undercut the efforts to hold Iran accountable. We know this because Iranian authorities have thrown these wrong statements back in our faces. The Iranians still regularly point to a statement made in error by the White House several years ago that Bob was not in Iran. That was wrong, but the U.S. government gave Iran an excuse not to send Bob home. And in January 2016, when other American hostages were released and Bob was left behind, the United States government let Iran get away with it. My husband served this country tirelessly for decades. He deserves better from us and from our government. In addition to being a patriot, Bob is an incredible husband and father. We have raised 7 children together. When our youngest daughter gets married in just 2 months, it will be the last daughter he has the opportunity to walk down the aisle. And everyone knows how important that is to a dad. Not a day or week goes by that I don't get a phone call from one of my children saying how much they miss Bob and struggle without him. We are all suffering a living nightmare. We wonder endlessly what kind of conditions my husband is living through. We know how deeply he must ache physically and spiritually from being away for us so long. By being away from anyone he knows and loves with absolutely no human rights, what kind of hell must he be living in that both our governments and Iranian authorities have allowed him to live in for so long? I want to close my testimony by asking each of you to imagine how devastated you would feel being ripped away from your family with no contact with your loved ones and no contact with the outside world. My husband has been held captive for 4,381 days. That's 12 years this Saturday without his family. Imagine how alone he must feel. We need your help. Today, Congressman Deutsch and Senators Menendez and Rubio introduced the Robert Levinson Hostage Recovery, Hostage Taking Accountability Act. I cannot thank them enough for their continued support for Bob and our family. I truly hope this will be something that brings Bob home. But when Saturday's anniversary passes and the media attention inevitably shifts, a different issue will take the priority, and we will again feel like we have this immense burden alone. Without you, we can't succeed. Please help my family to get Bob home. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Levinson. Mr. Namazi, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. I sit before you in utter desperation and disbelief that over 3.5 years into my family's indescribable anguish, both my 82-year-old ailing father, Bagher Namazi, and 47-year-old brother, Siamak Namazi, continue to unjustly and cruelly languish in Iran, each with 10-year prison sentences. For reasons I still do not understand, my innocent family was targeted by Iran's Revolutionary Guards and being used as pawns and hostages. Since this nightmare began, my family has faced the evil might and power of the IRGC, which has imposed on us a relentless and sustained campaign of cruelty, pain, suffering, lies, and horrors, which continue until today. I am here today, however, because it must be emphasized that the situation for my family, and especially my seriously ill father, is critical and swiftly heading towards an irreversible tragedy unless something is done and done urgently. I am here today to implore the Trump administration, the U.S. Congress, the United Nations, and really anyone at all to help me save the lives of my father and brother. Since my father's unjust imprisonment in February of 2016, he has been hospitalized 8 times, 2 of which required emergency heart-related surgeries, including the installation of a pacemaker. My father would only be rushed to the hospital by the IRGC when his health reached critical deterioration, and often his requests for medical attention were ignored, causing severe harm. My father lost over 20 pounds, was placed for extended periods in solitary confinement, and was subjected to severe psychological torment. While my father is currently on a restricted temporary medical furlough, his health continues to decline. In fact, the rate of deterioration is accelerating daily. Aside from his already weakened heart and related ailments, which continue to deteriorate, he has been recently diagnosed with epilepsy, as well as a 70% blockage of main arteries leading to his brain, significantly increasing the risk of a stroke. My father is getting weaker every day and cannot take a few steps without his knees buckling under him and loss of balance. It seems every day a new ailment unleashes itself on my frail father. We live in constant fear that at any moment my father will have his temporary medical furlough revoked and be dragged back to Evin prison. It is due to this fear that I reluctantly have been keeping a lower profile and drawing less attention to our plight. But as the only capable family member living in freedom, I must do all I can to save my beloved father and brother. I can no longer keep quiet. The horrific and painful reality is that my father is dying. He needs proper medical attention outside of Iran and is living on borrowed time. Unless he's allowed to leave urgently, I fear our already desperate circumstances will turn tragic. I have begged repeatedly, and do so again, for the Iranian government to allow my sick father to be allowed to leave Iran. We don't want my father to leave Iran in a coma or worse, dead. The situation is also terrible for my innocent brother Siamak, who has been languishing in Evin prison since October 2015. Mr. Chairman, going against all values that we stand for as Americans, the prior administration inexplicably and unforgivably left Siamak behind in January of 2016, when it brought other American hostages home. At the time, a mere promise made by the Iranians to release my brother within weeks provided license to leave an American behind in the name of the greater good of the nuclear deal. Well, we know how that horrific miscalculation turned out for my family. Not only was my brother not released, but the IRGC doubled down and also arrested my father, who has been lured back to visit my brother, shattering our lives beyond what we could have ever imagined. I spend a lot of time still wondering how our lives would have been so different today had Siamak not been abandoned in January of 2016. Both my father and Siamak are innocent and are being used as pawns and hostages. My father has spent his entire life serving humanity, including decades spent working with UNICEF in the most dangerous parts of the world. Growing up, my brother and I missed having my dad around terribly, but we understood the importance of his humanitarian mission. It is because of his impeccable record with UNICEF that the UN Secretary General, UNICEF, and hundreds of UN staff and retirees have privately and publicly reached out to the highest levels of the Iranian government to ask him to release my father on humanitarian grounds. Siamak similarly followed in my father's footsteps in serving humanity. In his most recent efforts, Siamak published a detailed report in 2013 that identified the negative effects of US sanctions on life-saving medicine and medical equipment reaching Iranian people. In part due to his work, the US government relaxed its rules to allow more life-saving medicine to reach Iranian people. I have engaged countless Trump administration officials to advocate for my family. With the recent appointment of the Special Presidential Envoy in Hostage Affairs, Robert O'Brien, I'm glad there is finally a person responsible for coordinating and leading the efforts to bring home hostages like my family. I am grateful to Robert and his team for working incredibly hard at this. However, the reality is that more than 2 years after President Trump's inauguration, at least to me, it seems that we're not any closer to bringing my family and other hostages home. While I do not understand the politics involved between our country and Iran, what I do know is that whatever has been tried so far has not worked. I strongly believe that only through direct engagement, focus on humanitarian imperative of bringing home American hostages, will there be a likelihood of success. While a direct dialogue will not guarantee success, in my view, the absence of dialogue will guarantee failure, a failure which would result in my father's death and my brother serving at least 10 years in prison. We cannot afford to spare any efforts. I'm counting on President Trump to stay good to his word, that Americans will not languish in Iran when he is president. The president has had great success in freeing other American hostages from other countries like North Korea, Venezuela, Turkey, Yemen, and Egypt. And I implore the president to spare no effort to bring my family and other American hostages home from Iran. Finally, I would like to share with you a part of a personal message from my dad to his UNICEF colleagues urging them to continue humanitarian efforts on behalf of the needy. My father sent this message to me as he was being forced back to Evin prison after one of his emergency heart-related surgeries. While the pain of those dearest to me continue to hurt deeply, I am also sorry that with the help of all of you and other great humanitarians, that I could not continue to serve our common cause of peace for children, especially the sorely troubled Middle East region, elimination of poverty through people empowerment, combating child trafficking, and opening space to hear the voices of the poor. Sustaining these great causes will be the best reward that can, God willing, be granted to this humble man. My father and brother have dedicated their lives to the most important causes of humanity. Now we desperately and urgently need humanity to be a voice for them before it's too late. Please be that voice. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Namazi, and thank you for sharing that message with us. Mr. Zaka.
Good afternoon. My name is Omar Zaka. I am the youngest of Nizar Zaka's 3 sons, and I'm speaking on behalf of all of us today. Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen of the Congress and the representatives of the American people, for the opportunity to speak to you today, and for the attention you give to my father's kidnapping. This is my second time here. I was first here in July 25, 2017. It's now nearly 4 years since I've seen my father. My father was last seen leaving his hotel on 18th of September 2015 on the way to the airport. He was kidnapped and taken hostage by the IRGC. My father was in Iran on the official invitation of the Iranian Vice President, Ms. Molaverde, who had invited my father to speak on the second conference on women in sustainable development. I repeat, he was officially invited to Iran by the Vice President of Iran. My father is an internet freedom advocate. He is the president of IJMA, an international NGO that specializes in information technology for development, based in Washington, D.C. He has spent most of his career working on bridging the digital divide between different communities around the world. In September 2018, 3 years after my father had been taken, his host, Mrs. Molaverde, admitted to the Associated Press that Iran had failed my father, and yet my father remains a hostage of the Revolutionary Guard. The last 4 years, and especially in the 2 years since the last hearing, my life has been very difficult for us. Time and again, our hopes that our father will be released have been shattered. My father has been subjected to physical and mental torture and ill treatment by his captors, who continue to exert pressure on him to make false confessions to support his crimes. Sometimes my father has been promised that if he confesses, he will be released. My father is a man of honor and integrity. He will not confess to a crime he has not committed. Somehow my father sustains his mental strength. He has just stopped a 3-week hunger strike a few days ago, the only means available to him to protest against his treatment. He stopped because we, his family and his friends, pleaded to him. His body cannot handle such a long hunger strike anymore. My father has been denied his human rights. When the foreign minister of Iran, Mr. Zarif, was once asked by the media about my father's case, his reply was that my father's case is a problem between the U.S. and Iran. What problem between the U.S. and Iran could justify kidnapping my father? Not a single day of those 4 years has passed that my family and I do not fear for my father's safety. The feeling of dread we experience if we miss my father's call or if we do not hear from him for 3 days is unbearable. We are tormented by the fear that something terrible has happened to him or will happen to him. In December last year, he was taken into incommunicado solitary confinement for approximately 40 days. We did not know where he was, if he was alive or dead. After 4 years of not seeing my father, I see him on film released by the Iranian TV while being arrested. The film was shamelessly broadcasted by the Iranian state news. The film, part of a smear campaign, it was broadcasted 4 times on primetime television. There is no truth whatsoever in these allegations. My father is innocent. We thank Secretary of State Mr. Pompeo for the following statement he made about my father in mid-September 2016 when he was in Congress, in which he said, "This week marks 1 year the Iranian government has been holding hostage Nizar Zakka, a U.S. legal permanent resident and international internet development expert. Mr. Zakka this week was sentenced to 10 years in prison, millions of dollars in fines. His only crime was to bring greater internet access to the women of Iran. Currently, my father is being held underground, sharing 4 crowded cells between 50 of them, about 17 men to each cell. The air in my father's cell is rank with the smell of sewage. It is infested with rats and bed bugs. There's no designated place for him to eat. My father spends 16 hours of each day and every day in a coffin-sized space where he sleeps and keeps all of his clothes and few of his possessions. They cannot see the sunlight or breathe fresh air at any time except for 2 hours a day during lunchtime. They have to choose to have lunch and miss the sun or to see the sun and miss lunch. My father's kidnapping is an act of state terrorism. Iran has conducted this practice of hostage-taking for over 40 years. We believe it will continue if you, the representatives of the American people, do not help to put an end to it. We have done everything possible in our capacity to put an end to this misery. We have reached out to the UN and other international human rights organizations, have launched petitions, we have campaigned for my father's cause in the media, and we have issued countless press releases done by my brothers and I about my father's case. But we feel like we are facing obstacles we do not understand. We are looking forward for President Trump to name my father and other hostages while condemning their arbitrary detention by IRGC. Such a statement will help us sustain the pain and suffering they're experiencing, knowing they are not forgotten. We ask America to take all available legal and diplomatic measures to reunite us with our father. We ask this government to do the same for all the families of the other hostages. Thank you again to the representatives of the American people for this opportunity and for your continuous support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zaka. Thank you to all of our witnesses. Let me begin by asking, on the July 2018 appointment of Robert O'Brien to serve as Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, the National Security Advisor, John Bolton, pledged that O'Brien would maintain a collaborative dialogue with the families of current hostages regarding diplomatic recovery efforts for their loved ones. I just would ask each of you, in your view, are Special Envoy O'Brien and his staff fulfilling that pledge, and in what areas could there be improvements from your very important perspectives? Ms. Levinson?
Robert O'Brien and his team are extremely helpful in our case. They are available whenever we need them to be. Their team coordinates any meetings that we need to have, and Mr. O'Brien himself is in contact with us whenever he feels he needs to give us an update on my father's case. So I think the hostage fusion cell, as it's called, is doing a good job and is necessary to maintain the status of one place where you can get all the information about a hostage.
Good. Thank you, Ms. Levinson. Mr. Namazi?
And so far as that office is concerned,
Could you turn the microphone on, please? Thanks. Wait, actually, sorry. Is it on?
is that on?
Okay, thank you very much.
The office has been very helpful. I've had no problem having communications. Obviously, it's important to have a single point who is leading and managing this. But obviously, from at least my point of view, while that office is very valuable and it's been very helpful to have the communications, we're all sitting here today because our loved ones are not with us yet.
Mr. Zaka?
We do appreciate all the support we're getting, and we hope to see more of the support in future.
Okay, thanks. Ms. Levinson, last May you told Time Magazine that your family had been left behind after the Trump administration prioritized securing the release of American hostages in North Korea. Have you seen increased focus from the Trump administration on your husband's case since the release of those Americans in North Korea?
Unfortunately, I have not. I feel that more could be done. Bob is still not home, and so it's necessary for the Trump administration to make it a priority. Bob is the longest held hostage, as I said before, and the United States government needs to get him home, and that's all we're asking for. It's not something that every American wouldn't want for their family.
It's a little unorthodox and probably not quite the right thing to do, but I've just asked each of you, since I know the White House watches what happens here, shares it with the president, do you have a message for the president?
I would ask that he would meet with us. He doesn't know us. He doesn't understand how difficult it has been for our family because he hasn't talked to us. We need to make sure that everyone in the United States government at the highest levels knows how difficult it is for any family to be away from their loved one and unable to resolve it themselves.
I appreciate that. Mr. Namazi? I'm not sure that it is.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I would welcome very much the president's direct engagement. I mean, again, in the case of my family, he set a very high standard for me personally, my family personally, when he tweeted about my family. And I have a feeling with the incredible success he's had with releasing other hostages from other countries, if he does meet with us and hear our stories, he will be even further motivated to spare no efforts, especially given the urgency of my father's health. I'm sure he'd be very keen to do more himself.
I appreciate it. Mr. Zaka?
I hope President Trump sees our case and puts a little bit more focus to it and to accomplish the same accomplishments he's done with other hostages throughout the world. And I hope our families are next to all of our families because we do miss them and we can't wait for them to come home.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate those messages. Mr. Wilson, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And this is one of the most meaningful hearings I've ever been to. And it's so meaningful because of your participation, your heartfelt presentation. And for Mr. Zaka and Mr. Namazi, if you're able, can you tell us the conditions that you know about your loved one, how being held, and the importance for the world to understand that the Iranian regime is not only holding your loved ones, but also abusing them? And if each of you could explain. Begin with Mr. Namazi and Mr. Zaka. And the only reason I didn't ask Ms. Levinson, because they still are concealing what occurred March the 9th.
Is this on?
So that's why I'm asking you.
Thank you. I mean, since arrest, there have just been absolutely horrific mistreatment. I mean, in the case of Siamak, there's been also physical abuse. This has included the use of tasers. He has been placed in solitary confinement and isolation for close to a year. In certain circumstances, there was a threat of electric shock, with the authorities going as far as actually putting wiring on him. He's had no mattress to sleep on for a very extended period of time. He was in a dark, cold cell. And in the case of my father, as I mentioned, he's on medical furlough right now. But while he was there, he has been, as an 82-year-old man, someone woke up one morning and decided that let's put this old man in solitary confinement for a few weeks. Who does this? Who wakes up and make a decision like this? We appreciate the attention, and it's been a painful decision for me to come out and speak publicly, as it has been for other family members. But I fear if I don't speak about this, it's important for the world to know that the suffering we're going and our loved ones are going through, and that's why the urgency.
Thank you. And Mr. Zaka?
The treatment of everyone in Evin, especially the ones taken from American citizens and other people, they do not care about their, physical condition. They do not care about their mental condition. They subject them to being in solitary confinement for extended periods of time with disregard of any human rights.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Levinson, it really is so impressive to be here with your family. And I look forward to having your input in trying to identify the most effective way forward from your experience, from your study, from your family study, and what talented family you have. What do you believe can be most effective to try to change the course of the Iranian conduct of the illegal concealing and holding of your husband?
I'm not sure what's going to resolve my husband's case. What I would hope is that both sides, the United States government and Iran, would work to get the cases of both my husband and all the other people being held hostage resolved. There's no reason for a government to hold an individual. I hope that the United States administration just continues to make it a priority to get all the hostages everywhere in the world home. These are the people who make up the United States. The United States is a country of freedom, and these people have no freedom. And that's what we need to make sure the other governments do, especially Iran.
And we go back to the Tripoli pirates. I mean, this has always been the standard of our country to recover hostages and not be subject to hostages. And sadly, and Ms. Levinson, in your situation, there has been no contact at all. But Mr. Namazi and Mr. Zaka, have you been in contact at all with the Iranian regime in terms of what may be required for their release, for your family's release?
I personally have had no contact with the Iranian government. No.
Neither do I.
And additionally, has there been any intimidation by all three of you, by the Iranian regime that could be directed from the Iranian regime. Has there been any intimidation effort on your family?
No, we haven't received any kind of intimidation. They haven't acknowledged that they have Bob officially, so they haven't done anything as far as intimidating us.
Half of my family was ripped away from me, so I don't think they needed to call and threaten anymore. Their action spoke very, very loudly. I know for a fact that my brother was constantly threatened with the arrest of my mom, for example. But from my perspective, I would have rather had threatening calls, I mean, between the decisions. And this is horrible to have to sit here and say this, but I'd rather be threatened, beaten, than have my father and none of my family members. But I wish they had taken me instead of my father, because he wouldn't be dying right now today, perhaps.
And Mr. Zaka?
To be honest, I couldn't have said it better than my peer, Mr. Namazi. We didn't have any intimidation, though we didn't have nothing to say, sir.
Again, as I conclude, I want to thank each of you and what wonderful families you have. God bless you.
Mr. Vargas, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, thank you for holding this hearing, and the ranking member also, and especially I want to thank the witnesses here today. Mrs. Levinson, obviously I listened very carefully to your testimony, and I mean, what was very moving was the sad situation that your daughter may be walking down the aisle again without your husband. I have two daughters, and I think that was very moving. And then when you were asked, if you could say anything to the president, you'd like to talk to him. And I hope you do get a chance, because you communicated that so well, how sad it is and how tormenting it is not to have your husband home, and how that also, Mr. Namazi, your dad and your brother, Mr. Zaka, your dad. I hope you get that opportunity, because I think there's more that we can do as a government to bring them home. I did want to ask specifically about that. I mean, my family's never been taken hostage. I hope they never do, obviously. And I want to know, what kind of contact do you have from the American government? Now, obviously, we talked about the special envoy, O'Brien, but what kind of day-to-day contact, or week-to-week, or month-to-month, or year-to-year, what kind of contact do you have officially with the government as we tell you what we're doing or what we can't do to help you?
In Bob's case, the United States government, as I said before, Bob was a retired FBI agent, so we have always maintained contact with the FBI. We did have contact with the State Department as well over the years, and we have met with the high-level officials that we need to over the years. As far as the hostage envoy goes, I feel that is much easier now, because there's one person who you get in touch with, and then you are able to get all the meetings you need through that one person. And the hostage envoy, Mr. O'Brien, does get in touch with us whenever he has new information to share. If we ask for a phone call, they are always willing to talk to us. I've never seen any problem with getting in touch with them about the case.
That's good to hear. My question was going to be, then he does communicate with you, then you don't only call him, he sometimes calls you if he has information.
Right. He will ask for a call with us, and we'll make an arrangement for actually the whole family to get on a conference line and talk about the case. And he has done that several times. And as I said, he's invited us to D.C. for meetings and so on. So he has done a very good job at this.
Thank you. Mr. Namazi, how about yourself?
I'm of course, in regular contact with senior administration officials, and I live in Dubai, so I come to Washington quite regularly, and on this trip also I did meet with them. I've had again not a difficulty in meeting with senior officials, although before the hostage envoy Mr. O'Brien was appointed, that there were changes, there wasn't continuity, and that was a challenge. That there was almost a restart. And I know they're working hard for the release of my family as well as the other family members that we have here. But at the same time, I fear there isn't enough is being done fast enough. I mean, especially in the sense of the urgency is very clear in the case of my father, and it has been clear for the past a year or two, and the deterioration has been very rapid. So while I'm very grateful for the engagement, I do hope that we can step up and deploy whatever tools we have as the American government, because obviously there's a lot we can do.
Yeah. Well, I know even your testimony, you were reticent to come up and speak because of you were hesitant because of potential danger, but thank you for your bravery, thank you for coming forward, and I know that you're very concerned because of your father's age and his illness, so I hope that this does encourage our government and obviously the regime in Iran to do more to release him. How about you, Mr. Zaka?
They do communicate with my lawyer, but personally they do not, and as needed.
So the special envoys never communicated
No,
with you
sir.
personally?
No, sir.
Okay. Do you feel like you get the information that you need?
No, sir.
You don't? Okay. So in your case, then, it does seem like we have to do a better job to communicate with you to let you know what's going on. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. I sure hope so.
Okay. My time has expired again. Thank you very much for showing the courage to come forward, and I hope we can help. And again, I want to thank the chair for the bills that they've proposed, and I certainly will support them. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Vargas. Mr. Shabbat, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to begin by thanking Mr. Deutsch for his commitment, I know, to the Levinson family. He's been involved in this for a long time. It's obviously much harder on the family, but I know it's something he's been committed to and done everything that he could for his constituents in this particular instance, so we appreciate that. I know how frustrating it's been for, obviously, the family principally, and but and a lot of the questions, I think, it mostly comes down to what can we do, and we're considering legislation. Have you all had a chance to review, or was that done in cooperation with you? Are there things that you'd like us to do additionally, other than supporting that legislation? Ms. Levinson in particular, was there something that you'd like to, for example, boy, I wish this would have got in the bill, or it didn't get in there. Are there any other thoughts that you have, or?
I personally haven't seen the wording on the bill, so I don't know exactly what it states. I would ask, a special envoy is, I think, something that is necessary, but I would hope that the administration would not use this as an excuse to pass the buck, so to speak, and not meet with the families themselves. I would like everybody to be able to see the families and see what they're going through and be able to help in any way possible. And sometimes I think because there is one person to go to who handles everything, it's hard. People just don't take the interest as much in the case. I don't think the overall government does that, and we need to do that.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let me ask this. I know one of the things that, being in your circumstances, and obviously none of us can relate to this unless we're actually under those circumstances, and we're not. But let me just ask you this. It must be very, very frustrating to have to kind of hold your tongue with respect to Iran and the government, knowing that they have your loved one over there, and if you express your outrage, that they can take it out on your loved one, so you have to be somewhat careful about that. Is that the case, or what? I'd be interested in hearing from each of you. Ms. Levinson?
Honestly, that's always in the back of my mind. We have, over the 12 years, been silent, and we've also tried to push them hard, and I do wonder every time we open our mouths whether it's going to have an effect on Bob and what happens to him, especially since we have no information about what they're doing to him right now.
Just as a member of Congress, I'm sure you're all familiar with Otto Warmbier, who was taken by the North Koreans. Well, I used to represent the little part of the greater Cincinnati area that he was in. Now it's Brad Wenstrup. And I think Brad felt the same way. We were very, as much as I hate Kim Jong-un and think he's a brutal, thuggish dictator who has who has done the most outrageous things to his own people, you sort of wanted to bite your tongue because you always thought if you're saying that, they might take it out on this person knowing that they have anything to do with you. So I was always very careful until he got back here, obviously in a terrible state. But that's got to be even tougher for the family. Mr. Namazi and Mr. Zaka, how about holding your tongue?
It's an extremely difficult decision. Being here today for me was a very difficult decision because the Iranian government will always take the easy way out and blame the victims for what it's doing to them. So every time I speak to the press, every time I come to hearings, which I wish it ends soon, that I'll be here to celebrate as opposed to be sharing the pain. But the fact is that it's important, I think, to if there's not attention given to my family and others, there could be even, I feel there could be even more mistreatment. So yes, I do fear, but I have to wrestle that versus the absolute silence of what that would mean for them. I don't have that luxury of knowing what's right and wrong all the time. I have to go with my gut feeling and, of course, the advice I get. The Iranians have always insisted on keeping it quiet because who wants this kind of publicity? Who wants this kind of attention? So I learned the difficult way because for the first year, since this nightmare started for my family, we did keep quiet. I broke my silence only when there was a conviction. And I have to say that was also encouraged by the previous administration to keep quiet, especially when my brother was left behind. No one wanted to get that kind of attention on that side as well.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, my time's expired because Mr. Zaka answered.
Of course,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Zaka, you're recognized.
I'm actually very fearful about what I say and what I do in front of the public in regards to IRGC or Iran, just because they're very unpredictable. They will take anything and just maybe put it out on him, and it does affect me. I don't know what I can say or what I cannot, and how they will perceive it. It is a constant fear whenever I do present myself in public towards this cause.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
First of all, I want to thank Chairman Deutsch for holding this hearing. This is an unmitigated tragedy for the families. I mean, it's hard to comprehend a brother, a father, a husband not going down the aisle with their daughters. It's mind-boggling. America's had a tradition of no person left behind, and we owe it to you folks to continue that. And I guess my first question would be, how would you characterize the differences between how the Obama administration was working on this versus the Trump administration? Mrs. Levinson?
The Trump administration, the hostage envoy was not in place during President Obama's first administration. He was only created the position was only created at the end of his second term.
And who was the hostage envoy?
James O'Brien. And now, with the Trump administration, that position has been in place since the beginning. And so it's a different situation, and it's difficult because I can't really judge the two administrations differently because of the two different situations. In the beginning, we had no contact with President Obama or his administration the way we do since the hostage envoy was created. So I would say that the hostage envoy is helpful. The difference is also the Obama administration was willing to talk to the Iranians, and the Trump administration has said they will not talk to the Iranians. So
It's going to be hard getting a resolution if we don't talk
Right.
to the Iranians.
Right.
Mr. Namzi?
I mean, again, you opened with a very correct statement. As Americans, we don't leave anyone behind. And with as I've mentioned a few times, but I can't help myself because it's just so. I'm living every day as a consequence of that. That's what I thought. That's what my family thought. That's what we all believe in. This is what America stands for. We realized on national television that my brother was left behind. So yes, it was Iranians, it was the Revolutionary Guards who took my family and kept them. But it was the Obama administration who chose to leave Siamak behind. For reasons I will not understand until today, my family will not understand. So my engagement, again, was very unique because for the first few months, obviously, that was still my family's only hope was the engagement. And I met with Jim O'Brien, an amazing person, and he cared. And people who take this position is not for the money, obviously, it's not for the glory. It's a thankless job, and I appreciate people who are dedicated to this. It's what policy is going to be implemented by these individuals, and what powers do they have? And I share Mrs. Levinson's concern that, yes, it's amazing and it's incredible to have the special presidential envoy because there is one person in charge. At the same time, I used to go to the White House quite often, and not that I want to go to the White House, don't misunderstand me, but I felt I was being more engaged with decision makers. And I think you had asked what can be done with the presidential envoy. I think perhaps empower him even more, and for him to be a principal, and we've spoken about a position as ambassador, because obviously whatever decisions are made at the White House, and especially with this administration that has a whole different approach with Iran, that becomes even more and more important.
Mr. Zaka.
I'm not very aware of how the government works and the policies that go around, at least most of them. But what I could see is that the new administration is more upfront with their activities and everything they do, a little bit more than the Obama administration.
Well, I'll tell you, I think it's certainly important, to Mr. Wilson's point, that we have an opportunity, you have an opportunity to sit down with the president at some point in time, sooner, not later, every day. It's a bad day. Yeah. And tell him your story, and if he has that as an imperative, he can get that job done. And we owe it to you to get that job done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Watkins, you're recognized.
I yield my time.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Keating?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank you and the ranking member for having this important hearing. I'd also like to say, Mr. Chairman, and I think as Mrs. Levinson knows in particular, that each and every opportunity over the years, you have been making sure that every possible committee hearing that we've had publicly, that people know that this is a priority for us, that these Americans are being detained without legal justification. And I'd like to really thank the witnesses for coming forward here today, because it's not easy. It takes a lot of courage, and I know how difficult that must be, but I also know how important it is that we hear your voices and that the rest of America hears your voices through these hearings. And I hope, too, the Iranians hear your voices. In fact, I will tell you, with your presence here, I want to say this, and I think I don't speak for myself in many ways, but this Congress, there's legislation to impose sanctions on those Iranians that are responsible for and complicit with politically motivated and extended detention or trial of U.S. citizens or legal permanent residents. And your presence here and hearing these stories and seeing the actions of the Iranian government in doing this will shape greatly the way I view that legislation. And that legislation would not only pertain to sanctions individually on those people, but on their families as well. So thank you for being here in that regard. We've heard most of what you've had to say. I have, like so many members, I have family members who are being detained, Paul Whelan, in Russia right now without legal justification. And I'd just like to ask one question, other than the statement I made. Is there anything outside the official areas of action that's taken by the State Department or by the envoy that we could ever be helpful with? You know, the effects on your family, maybe some help for your family and how they're coping with this, that there might be areas where we can provide some assistance. Before I did this, I was a district attorney, and I know the people suffering the kind of trauma you're having, although it's hard to compare some of that. I know that what they're going through as a family and what they're going through themselves. Could you suggest perhaps maybe some other resources that might help you or your family members to get through this?
Actually, I think the Victim Services Administration, the people in that group do help sometimes. I've been in contact with them, and they have helped my family. I don't know what else they can do right now.
I know there's only one thing that'll remedy the situation,
Right.
and that's getting them back.
Right.
And these are years of your life and their lives that are taken away, and all our lives are measured in years, and hours and minutes, and it's a terrible deprivation. Any other suggestions that you might have, other than you really don't have to suggest much or tell us. Your presence here says it all. So thank you for doing this, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. Mr. Waltz, please, you're recognized.
And thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member Wilson, for allowing me to support the families today and your important legislative efforts. And I just want to echo my colleagues of the Iranian, I don't even want to say habit, I want to say practice, deliberate state practice of hostage-taking that has been a part of their foreign policy since the taking of our embassy. In 1979, we may remember former Army officer and CIA officer Buckley, who was tortured and hung through the Iranian proxies, Hezbollah, in the 1980s, and they're still operating through proxies. I also want to call attention, in addition to your tragic cases, to the longest-held journalist in Austin Tice through the Syrian regime, backed by Iran. My question for you, well, before I get to my question, I certainly agree with my colleagues, and I'd be interested in your family's take on this as well. I certainly agree we need to turn up the pressure through sanctions that will be in this legislation. I think that's how the Iranian regime responds. I also understand your desire for dialogue and talk, and would certainly support a humanitarian track that is limited, but specifically talks about these cases and opens that up. My guardrail on that, and I'd be interested in your take, is that no other substance, though, and as a way to keep up the pressure to keep them to the table, no other substance in terms of improving our relationship, in terms of easing the sanctions, in terms of any other thing the regime wants, without resolution on these issues, whether it's the full release. My question is, one, your opinion there. Do you agree with that if the administration were to take that approach? And then secondly, specifically for you, Mr. Namazi, can you elaborate on how your brother was left behind, your understanding of how that happened? I think we need to get that out in the public consciousness in a very real way so that it never happens again with any other type of negotiation. So just first, you're a humanitarian track, but no other substance, and then secondly, if you can elaborate on that, Mr. Namazi.
Thank you. I believe it's very much consistent with American values of cherishing life and cherishing bringing Americans home. And we can only do that, in my view, and I don't think there are many people who disagree with that, really, is through dialogue, and a very narrow dialogue, just as you've described it, on a humanitarian track. We've managed to get other hostages home from countries that we thought we were going to go to war with imminently. You know, I'm referring to North Korea. Mm-hmm. If you recall, there were discussions and fear of a nuclear engagement. And within months, through dialogue, I would imagine, and other countries. So yes, I would very much support that. I believe not doing it would result in failure.
So not to interrupt you, Mr. Namazi, but you would agree then as a resolution in all of these cases with Iran is a precondition for any other talks?
From my point of view,
from your perspective.
From my point of view, this is the most important thing in the world for me, yes. I don't know why my brother was left behind. I've heard different stories. I've heard different versions, and I've also been accused, my family's also been accused unofficially, off the record by unnamed sources, that we never requested help. This is a puzzle that I will take to grave with me, I would imagine. But the fact is that Siamak was left behind. He was left behind when there was an opportunity not to leave him behind. And I think it was because it was so important to have a deal on a specific date, and that date could not be come.
You're referring to the Iran deal.
Yes, I can't imagine anything else. But I don't understand what happened in the back doors. I've heard different stories. I've never heard. I hope one day someone writes a book who knows what really happened and I can find out what happened to my family. But the painful truth is he was not on a plane when other hostages were on there. We found out about it. Didn't even get the heads up. Not that that would have made it any easier. But if someone had called and said, oh, we can't tell you why, but be prepared for bad news.
Mr. Namazi, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Just in the interest of the little bit of time I have remaining, I think there's a notion within media that we deal with it, in well-meaning, that they don't want to highlight these cases because they don't want to increase the value of these hostages that are clearly being held as part of hostage diplomacy. And as you've gone through this process, do you see now this horrible process you're going through, that there is actually value, more value? I know there's risks, and you've all described that there's risks to my colleagues, but it just as a way for us to help in highlighting these cases and keeping the spotlight on them, that there's more to be gained there than to be risk. Is that, is there a kind of consensus there amongst the families? And apologies, Chairman, for going over my time.
Bob was actually also left behind in that 2016 deal, and they were supposed to continue talking about his case, and they were supposed to have meetings between the United States government and the Iranian officials on Bob's case. After the deal was made, they had one meeting, and nothing happened, and it took from January to May before they had that one meeting. They had that one meeting and said they couldn't resolve the case, and so therefore nothing else was done. When asked about the differences between the two administrations, I would say that although the Trump administration has the hostage envoy in place, the Obama administration had an opportunity to get Bob home and failed to get him home, and they had 8 years to do it. I hope that President Trump doesn't follow that lead and leave Bob behind again. I think we need dialogue. I think we need to figure out how to make that dialogue happen, because the Iranians don't need to come to the table if they don't want to. Something has to change to make them want to come to the table.
Thank you very much, Mr. Waltz. Ms. Levinson, Mr. Namazi, Mr. Zaka, to your families, we're immensely grateful for your participation in our hearing today. Thank you for reminding us how extremely personal this is for you. Thank you for reminding us that we have a critical role to play in bringing your family members home. And I would echo what Mr. Wilson said. The power of your testimony today will help compel that we continue to act on behalf of your loved ones and do everything that we possibly can to ensure that this is the last time we ever have to have this hearing. Thank you, and this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.